All right, and we are recording, so we are going to get started. Good morning. Again, this is Katie Moore from Minnesota Housing. I'm the RFP lead in the multifamily division, and we are very excited to have you here today for the 2021 RFP 2022 Housing Tax Credit Round 1 Multifamily Scoring Training. This training provides guidance for completing the self-scoring worksheet, which is in the scoring wizard this year. And just so you know, your line will be muted and you will be in listen-only mode for this presentation. If you have a question, please type it into the question box and we'll answer throughout the webinar. And because we'll be pressed for time, we're not going to pause for questions during this webinar unless we feel it's an important question to be addressed with the entire group. We will follow up with you through the questions chat, and there is a second scoring training that will be available later on this month, and that one may have more time available for question and answers in that session. All right. At Minnesota Housing, we believe in our mission. Housing is the foundation for success. So we collaborate with individuals, communities, and partners to create, preserve, and finance housing that is affordable. We offer products that support the development and preservation of affordable rental housing through financing and long-term asset management. We also offer products and services to help Minnesotans buy and fix up their homes, stabilize neighborhoods, communities, and families. And we want to thank you for being part of our mission. This tutorial will cover minimum thresholds, Minnesota Housing strategic priorities, and selection categories and criteria. Please note, technical assistance provided by Minnesota Housing staff is only advisory and does not guarantee that a development will receive points under a particular category or be selected for funding. While every effort is made to ensure the accuracy of technical assistance, such as assistance to subject to, such assistance is subject to and does not modify or override the requirements of Minnesota Housing's Qualified Allocation Plan, the self-scoring worksheet, the multifamily application instructions, the multifamily underwriting standards, or other documents related to applications for funding. Applicants are encouraged to review the materials available on the Minnesota Housing website and consult with legal counsel and, if applicable, a knowledgeable tax professional to ensure compliance with all applicable application, submission, and project requirements. So here is our agenda for today. We'll cover what some of you need to know for the self-scoring worksheets. This document will be your companion document during this training, so hopefully you have this available. This is linked in the documents of the GoToWebinar. We advise you to have it open or ideally printed and have it next to you so that you can take notes. And this training is meant to be a high-level overview. We'll cover some details, but all of the details can be found in the self-scoring worksheet that is on our website in PDF form. And for more information, we'll show you where to go to access this information. All right, so there are two key documents that you're going to need on the website. They're called the revised 2022 and 2023 self-scoring worksheet. And this is the source of truth for all scoring. This worksheet will be your main reference tool for understanding the points you claim. The scoring guide for the 2021 Consolidated RFP and 2022 HTC Rounds 1 and 2 is the companion document and references back to the self-scoring worksheet and provides additional clarification. Much of the supporting documentation is listed in the self-scoring worksheet, but the scoring guide contains more details and clarifications. In some instances, helpful tools and templates are linked in the scoring guide, and this training will review these tools and templates. You'll enter your scores into the scoring wizard in the multifamily portal instead of the Excel spreadsheet that everyone is used to. And once you enter your scores, you'll also upload your documents into the portal checklist items like normal. Make sure that your documentation matches what you entered into the scoring wizard. Review both of these documents to make sure your applications are competitive and are eligible to receive the points you are claiming. And we encourage you to get technical assistance early on in the process so that you understand the scoring materials so that your application can be as competitive as possible. So the documents that I just referenced here, this is a screenshot of where you can find them on Minnesota Housing's website. The PDF version of the scoring guide or of the self-scoring worksheet and the scoring guide are both available on this page now. And then on Wednesday, all application materials will be published when the RFP is published on the 14th. So getting into an overview of scoring, all projects must meet at least one of the agency strategic priorities or the statutory strategic priority within the HTC statute for tax-exempt bonds. These strategic priorities are no longer going to be captured in the self-scoring worksheet directly. There's a question in the rental housing narrative that applicants are required to submit, where you're going to select one or more of these priorities and provide information about how your project meets those. So strategic priorities no longer in the self-scoring worksheet. You must meet one of our agency strategic objectives listed on this slide here, or the strategic priority listed in the tax credit statute for those tax-exempt bond projects. This year, we have two preferences for projects. The first is eventual tenant ownership. Some of you may remember this used to be a scoring category. It's now a preference, and it will be used as one of the tiebreakers for tax credit applications. And also, the innovative construction methods preference was added this year with a goal to reduce total construction costs by at least 10%. And the pre-application, which is required for innovative construction techniques, that is due this Wednesday, April 14th. So as you all know, scoring is an integral part of the RFP application process and is one of several ways that Minnesota Housing selects projects for funding. Tax credit projects must meet a minimum point requirement to move forward in the RFP. And so for 9% tax credit projects, the minimum point requirement is now 80. This is a change from last year. So the 9% projects, minimum score of 80 to move forward. And for 4% tax credit projects, the minimum point requirement is still 40. It's important for applicants to know that these point thresholds represent the minimum points needed, but in reality, competitive projects score much higher. And for documentation of points, it's important to remember that Minnesota Housing will only award points if they were claimed by applicants and they meet the supporting documentation requirements outlined in the self-scoring worksheet and the scoring guide. Minnesota Housing will reduce points if the documentation does not meet these requirements. Think of it like you need to state your case and provide evidence for why you should receive points. And make sure, so the key message here, make sure you're claiming points. Documentation needs to meet all of the requirements in the self-scoring worksheet in the guide, and it must be uploaded into Portal so that we can access it and review it while we are scoring projects. You'll be prompted by the scoring wizard to document your units for each selection criteria. You will be asked to enter either the total number of units or the number of restricted or assisted units for each selection criteria. Restricted and assisted mean the same thing for scoring purposes. Note, there are certain minimum unit requirements, rent restrictions, and income restrictions. Refer to the self-scoring worksheet and scoring guide as you claim your points. And Minnesota Housing will validate the number of units with the multifamily workbook and will reduce points if the documentation does not meet the requirements. See the instruction section of the scoring guide for more information. We provide a lot of details about this in that document. New this year, we added points. We have points available for PWD units eligible for Section 811 project-based rental assistance. You must complete the pre-app to be eligible for this, as well as meet the PWD requirements in the self-scoring worksheet. Also new is the extended duration, which is a tax credit requirement. This language is found on page 5 of the self-scoring worksheet. And this is a change from previous years where owners applying for funds agree to waive the qualified contract and the rental and occupancy restriction applies for the term of the LURA. Deeper rent targeting. All projects this year must set aside a minimum of 2% of the units at 30% MTSP rent levels and must set aside a minimum of 3% of units at or below, with rents at or below the housing assistance payment standard. All 9% applicants in round 1 must meet a minimum threshold, and there are 5 threshold categories available to applicants. These are projects in the metropolitan area, projects outside of the metropolitan area, projects that are not restricted to persons of a particular age group, with a percentage of the unit set aside and rented to persons with a disability, preserving existing subsidized housing, and rural development. Projects can meet more than one threshold, and we actually encourage applicants to seek out multiple thresholds. So for example, a preservation project might also meet the metropolitan area threshold. And so for the sake of time, we're keeping the thresholds pretty high level since there aren't any changes from previous years. And now we're going to run through the selection criteria, and this is the most important information to pay attention to as you are scoring your application. There are 7 selection categories that establish the scoring framework, and these categories are greatest need tenant targeting, serves lowest income for long durations, which includes preservation this year, increasing geographic choice, supporting community and economic development, efficient use of scarce resources, building characteristics, and for 9% tax credit applications, unacceptable practices. Each category is broken down into various selection criteria that equal points. The first selection category is greatest need tenant targeting, and the scoring criteria in this category are large family housing, new this year senior housing, permanent supportive housing for high priority homeless, which includes additional points for continuum of care, people with disabilities, and new this year, Section 811, which we will talk more about shortly. So the first scoring criteria under the greatest need tenant targeting category is large family housing. Large family housing is for proposals that provide family housing that is not restricted to persons 55 years or older. If selecting this criterion, applicants agree to market to families with minor children, and at least 75% of the total assisted units contain 2 or more bedrooms. And applicants can claim additional points if at least 1/3 of the 3+ bedrooms contain 4 or more bedrooms. The unit calculation is based on the number of assisted units. An assisted unit is defined as tax credit units for tax credit applications and affordable units for deferred funding. Minnesota Housing will validate the number of units entered into the scoring wizard with the number of units indicated on the rent grid in the housing income tab of the workbook. And this goes for all categories. We will be validating units, rents, incomes, etc. on this tab in the multifamily workbook. The second scoring criterion in the greatest need tenant targeting category is senior housing, and this is a new scoring category this year. For senior housing, 100% of the assisted units must be restricted and marketed to seniors aged 55 plus. And it's important to note that only one member of the household needs to meet that age threshold, but all 100% of the assisted units need to be marketed to seniors aged 55 plus. Applicants can take additional points for further restricting a percentage of the units to the 30% income level consistent with the Housing Infrastructure Bond statute. So we're just going to pause here and point out a project can either be senior housing or large family housing, but it cannot be both. And additionally, senior housing units that are further restricted cannot overlap with rental assistance units that are further restricted. So you need to pick one or the other for those categories. The third scoring criterion in the greatest need tenant targeting category is permanent supportive housing for high priority homeless. To be eligible for HPH points, the project must meet the HPH threshold requirements and have a minimum of 5% of the total units, but no fewer than 4 units set aside and rented to households prioritized for permanent supportive housing by the coordinated entry system. Applicants can receive additional points if a project prioritizes the local need identified by the local continuum of care. Note that applicants can see the COC priorities listed for a project county by reviewing the continuum of care priorities methodology on our website, and that is also linked in the scoring guide. And we're going to pause here again. HPH and PWD units, which we'll talk about next, cannot be claimed on the same unit. You can have HPH and PWD units in the project, but they cannot overlap with each other. The HPH calculation is based on the number of total units. Make sure the scoring wizard and the multifamily workbook numbers match. The HPH units must be marked as HPH units on the rent and income grid of the workbook, and the type of rental subsidy must be indicated. If no subsidy is available, rent levels must be underwritten to the supportive housing unit underwriting standards outlined in the multifamily underwriting standards, and they must be financially feasible. And again, HPH units cannot overlap with PWD units, which we'll talk about next. And also keep in mind that rural development projects may be prohibited from selecting particular rent and income restrictions and or tenant household types. So you want to make sure to consult with RD and Minnesota Housing staff with any questions related to this prior to submitting an application. The fourth scoring criterion under the greatest needs tenant targeting category that we briefly mentioned earlier is people with disabilities, also known as PWD. To be eligible for this category, projects must meet the PWD threshold requirements and have a minimum of 4 units. The proposal must not have age restrictions on any of the units to be eligible for PWD points. So again, I'm going to say that again. The proposal must not have any age restrictions on any of the units in a project to be eligible for the PWD point. A percentage of the units are set aside and rented to people with disabilities, and that is outlined in more detail in the self-scoring worksheet. Again, Minnesota Housing will validate the number of PWD units and all other information with the multifamily workbook that's submitted. The units must be marked as PWD on the rent and income grid in the workbook, and the income limit should be restricted to the 30% MTSP limit. The type of rental subsidy must also be indicated. If no subsidy is available, projects must be underwritten to the appropriate underwriting standards outlined in the multifamily underwriting standards, and the project must be financially feasible. Again, RD projects, rural development projects, may be prohibited from selecting particular rent and income restrictions or tenant household types. To make sure if you are working with an RD project that you consult RD and Minnesota Housing staff ahead of submitting your application to make sure that everything looks correct. PWD units, again, cannot overlap with HPH units discussed previously. And again, keep in mind that this category does not permit age restrictions. So senior projects are ineligible for PWD points. And also any projects that even contain a small portion of units with age restrictions would not be eligible for PWD points. And we're going to pause here again and just a reminder one more time, HPH and PWD units cannot overlap. You can have both in the project, but they cannot overlap with each other. The second selection category is serves lowest income for long durations. So the scoring criteria in this category are preservation, rental assistance, serves lowest income tenants / rent reductions, and long-term affordability. The first scoring criterion under serves lowest income for long durations is preservation. Projects must meet one of 3 risk of loss thresholds. Additionally, projects must meet one of 3 scoring criteria. The most notable item to keep in mind for preservation is that preservation projects cannot claim rental assistance and in certain cases cannot claim serves lowest income points. The dependencies between these criteria can be tricky, and we have provided further clarification in the scoring guide. Applicants with preservation projects are strongly encouraged to get technical assistance ahead of submitting their application. The second scoring criterion in the serves lowest income for long durations category is rental assistance. The distinction between preservation and rental assistance projects is based upon their rental assistance contract and is defined in the self-scoring worksheet. Applicants will receive priority if a fully executed binding commitment for project-based rental assistance is submitted with the application. A binding commitment could include a binding resolution or a binding letter of approval from a governing body. Units with rental assistance must be counted in this category. The unit cannot be counted towards the serves lowest income category. For example, a 40-unit project with 40 rental assistance vouchers cannot claim points in serves lowest income. Commitment documentation must be fully executed, state the name of the project, and include the number of units. Commitment documentation for further restricting incomes no longer needs to state that the approval of the governing body. Commitment documentation contingent on the Minnesota Housing Award is acceptable. And for private rental assistance, keep in mind that in addition to the items above, the commitment documentation must be for at least 4 years. Minnesota Housing will validate the number of rental assistance units with the workbook. The units must be marked as rental assistance on the rent and income grid, and the type of rental subsidy must be indicated. And again, make sure you're providing fully executed binding commitments as your supporting documentation. And another reminder, a commitment can be contingent on receiving an award from Minnesota Housing. but it cannot be subject to a third-party RFP to award vouchers. So it can be contingent on receiving award from Minnesota Housing, but it cannot be subject to additional approvals from some third-party process. And pausing here again to reiterate that preservation projects cannot claim rental assistance. And again, the dependencies between these criteria can be tricky. And so we did provide further clarification in the scoring guide. And applicants are strongly encouraged to get technical assistance, generally speaking, and especially for preservation projects, because some of the dependencies can be particularly tricky. The third criterion in this category is serves lowest income tenants / rent reduction. And just like last year, applicants can claim points for a percentage of units with rents that are below the 50% MTSP rent limit. New for this year, applicants can receive additional points for further restricting units to the 30% MTSP rent limits. Minnesota Housing will validate the number of units with the multifamily workbook, so make sure the workbook matches the information that you are claiming in the scoring wizard. And pausing here again, serves lowest income selection criteria cannot be claimed for units that qualify as units that have new or existing rental assistance. So this would include people with disabilities Tier 2, Section 811, and preservation Tier 1, existing federal assistance, and also rental assistance. So serves lowest income cannot overlap with rental assistance. And then just a quick screenshot here. Here is the where the rent and income limits can be found on our website. It's right under quick links on the left-hand side of our webpage, and it is the first link under quick links. The fourth and final criterion in the serve lowest income for long duration category is long-term affordability. And the key change here is that deferred projects are now eligible, and we also added additional points for 50-year terms. Excuse me. The next category is increasing geographic choice, and it includes 3 criteria this year. The need for more affordable housing options, which is new this year, workforce housing, which previously existed, and access to transit was renamed to transit and walkability, but that category will be familiar to folks as well. And we did eliminate economic integration and higher performing schools from this category. To help you score the geographic scoring categories, you can use the Community Profiles tool located on our website. You can see in the screenshot here, it is already available on our website if you go to the Community Profiles page. Communities with a need for more affordable housing options can now receive points under this year's QAP. Applicants can use the Community Profiles tool to see if their project is eligible based on its location. No supporting documentation is required here. Under transit and walkability, this category has 2 key components: access to fixed transit and then walkability. Applicants claim eligibility based on how their project fits into 3 geographic categories: metropolitan area, the greater Minnesota urbanized areas, and greater Minnesota rural and small urban areas. Scattered site projects should use a weighted average for eligibility based upon the total number of units that meet each category. And applicants do not need to submit supporting documentation here unless they are claiming points for demand response or dial-a-ride services. So the scoring guide has more information about these categories, including when supporting documentation is needed and what is needed to demonstrate eligibility of points. The fourth selection category is supporting community and economic development. And there are 6 scoring criteria in this category: community development initiative, equitable development, which is new this year, rural and tribal, QCT, community revitalization, tribal equivalent areas, and now opportunity zones, multifamily award history, which is new this year, and Black, Indigenous, and people of color-owned or women-owned business enterprises. The first scoring criterion under supporting community and economic development is the Community Development Initiative. To be eligible, projects must be a targeted geographic area, and applicants must submit a map of that area. So the project must be in a targeted area and a map is required with the supporting documentation. Applicants need to submit a copy of the initiative or the plan, and keep in mind that affordable housing must be listed as a key strategy of that plan that you're submitting. Applicants need to submit a stakeholder list that identifies the roles of each of the stakeholders. And most importantly, applicants must submit a copy of the Community Development Initiative narrative. And within that, there's a question: applicants must outline the current implementation plan and identify completed, underway, or planned milestones. The project does not need to have all 3, but should have at least 1 completed, at least 1 underway, or at least 1 planned milestone that we would like to see outlined. And keep in mind, applicants in a qualified census tract, or also known as QCT, must provide additional documentation demonstrating commitments of public or private investment in non-housing infrastructure. Eligible initiatives or plans could include neighborhood plans, county plans, comprehensive plans. Keep in mind, comprehensive plans will not count on their own. You must submit that Community Development Initiative narrative as a supplement, including all updates and supporting documentation. Plans or initiatives that are not eligible, housing and market studies would not meet requirements of this category. Excuse me. The second criterion in this category is equitable development. It's new this year, and it is designed to amplify the voices, inputs, and needs of communities most impacted in the development process. To be eligible for equitable development, applicants must submit documentation that meets all 4 threshold criteria at the time of application. We'll go through each threshold item in more detail, but here's a list of the threshold criteria so you can see them all in one slide. Applicants must complete the equitable development narrative and submit documentation demonstrating how the initiative meets the requirements. Any documentation, plan, or data referenced in the narrative must be provided to demonstrate the project meets the criteria. So the first threshold is significant involvement of a qualified stakeholder group. A qualifying stakeholder group must have meaningful representation of communities most impacted, who have an active and participatory role in shaping and carrying out the priorities and goals of that stakeholder group. Its mission and purpose must have some connection to uplifting and supporting communities most impacted in its work. Multiple qualified stakeholder groups are acceptable, but each one must on their own meet the threshold criteria. And you can refer to the self-scoring worksheet for a full list of what is needed in the narrative. So threshold 1B, the second threshold, housing disparity addressed by development. Applicants must provide data for at least one community most impacted, represented by the qualified stakeholder group, demonstrating housing disparity, and then identify how the project will address that disparity. So examples of data could include, but are not limited to, the Wilder Foundation's Community Compass, published research or evaluation reports, or federal, state, or local government data. And if you have questions on what could be included as data, please reach out for technical assistance. The third threshold is significant involvement of a qualified stakeholder group. Explain how the qualified stakeholder group was involved in the development, the specific input they provided, and how the project responds to that input. So there must be a signed letter from the qualified stakeholder group. And an example of this could be for design, a qualified stakeholder group representing an immigrant community most impacted, meaningfully involved in the architectural design, which directly responds and changes the design of the overall project. The final threshold, the final threshold is a signed letter from the qualified stakeholder group that addresses all the things outlined in the self-scoring worksheet. So again, this is a new category. It's new for you, it's new for us. We're really, the impact is really, again, to make the voices of communities most impacted heard in the development process. So if you have questions, please reach out for technical assistance, and we are more than happy and willing and excited to work with you on this category, to look at your plans, to think about what you're proposing, and to see how it fits into the scoring category. So the other categories under community and economic development, rural, tribal, this did not have any changes this year. No supporting documentation is required, and you can use that community profiles tool to see if the project is eligible for points. QCT, community revitalization, tribal equivalent, and opportunity zones. Not much has changed here. This year, projects can receive points if it's located in an opportunity zone. Again, no supporting documentation is required. And keep in mind that if you are claiming this as a QCT, applicants must submit a plan that meets the requirements for a community development initiative and receive points under that category. So again, if you're claiming the QCT points, you must also claim and be awarded community development initiative points. Also new this year, multifamily award history. Applicants can receive points if the project is located in a community that hasn't received a multifamily Minnesota Housing Award in the past 5 years. You can review the multifamily award history methodology to see if your project is eligible. No supporting documentation is required here. And that methodology is on our website, and it is also linked in the scoring guide for reference. What was previously known as Maybe-Weeby has been changed to Black, Indigenous, and people of color owned and women-owned business enterprises. Nothing was changed to the ownership requirements of this category. It needs to be 51% owned by one or more BIPOC or women, and their management and daily business operations need to be controlled by one or more BIPOC or women who own it. Nothing changing here. What did change is applicants are now eligible for additional points for partnership with BIPOC WEB entities. So applicants must provide an agreement executed between the partnering entities that defines specific duties and roles, and explicitly states the goal of building the BIPOC WEB's capacity to develop, manage, construct, design, or own affordable housing in the future. The fifth selection category is efficient use of scarce resources and leverage. There are 3 scoring criterion in this category: financial readiness to proceed, leveraged funds, other contributions, and intermediary costs. Cost containment was eliminated this year. That used to fall under this category, but cost containment is no longer a thing. So the first scoring criterion under efficient use of scarce resources is financial readiness to proceed / leveraged funds. The intent of this criterion is to give applicants credit for secured funding commitments for permanent capital funding sources. The key change this year is that the denominator no longer has any exclusions. The numerator excludes the first mortgage and estimated tax credit proceeds. The calculation now shows the total committed in comparison to total development costs. All secured funding commitments for capital funding must be counted under this criterion. They cannot be claimed under other contributions. Let me say that again. All secured funding for capital funding must be counted here under financial readiness. It cannot be counted under the other contributions criterion. And so this calculation can be calculated by dividing the total secured funding by the total development cost. The self-scoring worksheet and the scoring guide contain detailed information and examples of acceptable documentation and source examples. And we also have a link to the scoring calculation worksheet so that you can type in the sources and it will help calculate the percentage for you. The second scoring criterion under efficient use of scarce resources is other contributions. So the intent of this criterion is to give applicants credit for non-capital sources that reduce development costs and are not reflected on the sources or uses in the workbook. So examples of this could be waivers of fees, land donations, or any other contributions that reduce the overall cost of the project. All non-capital sources must be counted in this calculation and not in the financial readiness calculation described earlier. So again, all non-capital sources are counted under other contributions. And the self-scoring worksheet again and the scoring guide contain detailed information and examples of sources, acceptable documentation, etc. So please make sure you're paying close attention when you are scoring this category and getting all of your documentation ready for submission. The third scoring criterion under efficient use of scarce resources is intermediary costs. Generally speaking, intermediary costs are soft costs associated with third-party services related to project development. So for example, architect fees, engineering fees, appraisal fees, fees for a historic consultant, etc. Projects receive more points for negotiating lower costs. And the self-scoring worksheet contains the only exclusions that will be allowed for this calculation. So again, the self-scoring worksheet contains the only exclusions that will be allowed. So Minnesota Housing will cross-reference the workbook with the self-scoring worksheet and the exclusions that are listed. Keep in mind that large amounts of exclusions should be backed up by supporting documentation and submitted with your application. The sixth selection category is building characteristics, and there are 3 scoring criterion here: universal design, smoke-free buildings, and enhanced sustainability. For universal design, new this year, applicants must submit the universal design worksheet. The universal design worksheet and the architectural and construction application items will be reviewed to determine eligibility for this item. The determination to award points will be made at the sole discretion of Minnesota Housing. For elevator buildings, 100% of the assisted units must meet the definition. For non-elevator buildings, at least 10% of the units must meet the definition. So I just want to reiterate, this is new this year. The universal design worksheet and all of the architectural and construction items submitted applications must demonstrate eligibility for this criteria at the time of application in order to receive points. If you have any questions, please make sure that you're reaching out for technical assistance, and we will connect you with one of our staff architects for more information. The second criterion under building characteristics is smoke-free buildings. Applicants are certifying at the time of application that a lease addendum and written smoke-free policies will be provided during the due diligence process if selected. So no supporting documentation is required here, but it is a certification that in the due diligence process, if selected, there will be a lease addendum and smoke-free policies provided. The third and last selection criterion under the building characteristics category is enhanced sustainability. Applicants have 3 tier options, including 2 or 3 times the minimum number of optional criteria, or conforming to one of 3 alternative performance pathways. This category is very nuanced, and this training is meant to be higher level, so we do encourage, if you are interested in enhanced sustainability points, to reach out to Minnesota Housing, request technical assistance, and we will get a staff architect assigned to your project to help with this category. So the final selection category is unacceptable practices. This category only applies to tax credit projects, and it may only apply to specific tax credit types. So for example, a 9% or 4%. Minnesota Housing will impose penalty points on projects where warranted while we are scoring. And just a reminder again, the self-scoring worksheet is the source of truth. When you are scoring your application, you're going to be entering scores into the scoring wizard this year instead of that Excel spreadsheet. You need to make sure that your documentation matches what you're entering into the scoring wizard. Minnesota Housing does validate all of the supporting documentation, including the workbook, against scores that are claimed by applicants. And the scoring guide is your reference tool to the self-scoring worksheet. It provides additional clarification, guidance, and links to other resources when applicable. And just another reminder that we encourage all applicants to get technical assistance to help them when submitting applications to the RFP. So we made really great time this morning. We have about 10 minutes left. We are in a webinar format, so the phone lines are muted, and I can't open those up for questions, but let me pull up the questions chat and see if there was anything submitted that we can address with the whole group. Let's see here. Let me just try to pull out this. Bear with me here with the technical stuff. Okay, so we do have a few questions, so let's go through those. Okay, the first one, hold on, let me make this box bigger. Sorry, everybody, please continue to bear with me. I'm still not super comfortable in doing training in this online format. I'm just trying to expand the box so I can read everybody's questions. Okay, can you provide some specific examples of the innovative construction techniques that you're looking for? So we did have staff that were answering these questions along the way. So I'm just going to read the question and then the answer that was provided to the benefit of the whole group so everyone can hear that information. So can you provide specific examples of the innovative construction techniques? The answer, information regarding the techniques is currently available on our website. We go into detail in that document. And then if you have any questions, please reach out and we'll connect you to our staff architects. They are the subject matter experts on this area. That is not something that I would feel comfortable speaking in depth to. And then also keep in mind that a pre-app is required for innovative construction techniques, and that is due this Wednesday. Excuse me. Let's see, do the provisions being described for tax credits also apply to deferred loans, or do the requirements differ in some ways? So strategic priorities, those are required for all projects. Minimum thresholds are only required for 9% tax credit projects in round one. And then all of the scoring criteria, that is applicable to all projects. So hopefully that helps clarify. Strategic priorities applicable to everybody. Minimum thresholds only applicable to 9% projects. And then obviously scoring applicable to everybody. What are the minimum point requirements for deferred only applications? So there are no minimum point requirements for deferred projects. However, those projects do get ranked, and so the more competitive, the more likely an award of deferred funds will be. I will note that typically deferred only projects, we don't get many of those in the RFP, but they do need to score, but there is no minimum point requirement, but I would encourage folks to be as competitive as possible, whenever possible, when it comes to scoring. There was a question about what do you mean by the minimum threshold? So again, there are minimum thresholds for tax credit projects. Those are outlined in the self-scoring worksheet. It's under that minimum threshold section. So all projects need to meet at least one. I believe there are 3 different options for metropolitan area. SRO, there are a couple different options. That's one. There is a minimum threshold that Greater Minnesota projects could meet. There is a preservation minimum threshold, projects that will serve a portion of units for people with disabilities, as well as RD. So those are the different thresholds that a 9% tax credit application would need to meet, at least one or more. And then the points threshold is separate. So the points, all tax credit projects, regardless of what minimum threshold they meet or how many, all need to meet 80 points. So there's kind of 2 tests that 9% applications need to meet in order to be processed. A question, does the qualified stakeholder group need to be a formed entity or nonprofit, or can the group be an informal representative group that is just involved in the project? So answer to that, a separate entity is not required. The group can be informal and comprised of multiple entities. So hopefully that is helpful. The qualified stakeholder group, it can be an informal group. Another question, can the deeper rent targeting unit be the PWD/HPH unit with the housing support or other rental assistance, or do they have to be in addition to supportive housing units? And the answer to that, deeper rent targeting units, which are required for all applications, they can overlap with any of the selection criteria, including HPH or PWD. Another question here, can you confirm that if the unit has rental assistance, you cannot claim points under CERB's lowest income, even if you don't claim points for the units under rental assistance? So there's two questions in this, and that is the first one. So that is correct. If a unit has rental assistance, you cannot claim the CERB's lowest income points for that project. Let's see. And then if so, can you also confirm that the extra points for the CERB's lowest income household targeted at 30% cannot be claimed for rental assistance, and that is correct. So rental assistance and the further restricting rental assistance is mutually exclusive of CERB's lowest income, and those cannot overlap with each other. Another question, when will the scoring wizard be made available in portal? On Wednesday, and when we publish the RFP. So we are very excited and looking forward to that. So Wednesday, the RFP will publish, the portal will open, you can start spinning up your projects, the checklist will be there, and the scoring wizard will be there. Can the same units used to comply with deeper rent targeting also be used to satisfy further rent restriction, the 30% further rent restriction under CERB's lowest income criteria? And the answer to that is yes. The deeper rent targeting can overlap with any of the selection criteria, and so they can overlap with any of the units that you're claiming in other places. Do we know when we'll publish the 2021 rent and income tables? I do not know that off the top of my head, but I know that these just came out, and our compliance team is working on updating those rent and income grids, and we will send them out via e-news once they're ready. So if you aren't already, please make sure you're subscribed to e-news, and then you can get notified as soon as they're available. If 4% applications are required for all LIHTC projects, oh, here, let me read this one in my head first. So I think what this question is saying, if you're submitting an application for a dual application, where one structure is 9% and one structure is 4%, how is the scoring handled for both options? The score is the same going forward. So many of the updates that we made to the QAP made it so that one score can be used across the board, regardless of how your project is structured. And if you're submitting a 9% application, a 4% application is not required along with it. So you can submit just a 9% application for your project. A dual application is not required. However, many people do submit a dual application with their primary structure as that 9% structure, and then a secondary 4% dual application to kind of maximize competitiveness. So it's not required to submit both. You can if you want to, and the score would be the same. And all other aspects of that project need to be the same too. So same project, same plans and specs, same tenant population, all that needs to be the same. Hopefully that was helpful. So we are right at 11, and we ran through all of the questions, so that's great. I'm glad we got a chance to do that. This will be recorded and posted on our website at a later date, so that folks can rewatch it again. Please make sure to reach out and request technical assistance from us. And then we also have another training available shortly, I think in the next 2 weeks. I apologize, I don't know the date off the top of my head, but we will try to provide a little bit more time for question and answers in that session as well, because I know folks have a lot of questions. So thank you so much, everybody, and please enjoy the rest of your day.